Hello everybody, welcome back to Alan Wall's Photography. This is Alan and today we're talking about the common focus stacking artifacts that make our lives so miserable. This video is going out to Alison Pollock, who is my favorite slime mold photographer and is named after my favorite North Atlantic codfish, which is irrelevant, I suppose. Thanks to everybody who left comments regarding the My Pandemic effort. I really appreciated the kind words and the encouragement. I really did. And if anybody would like to take a leisurely look at all of the finalist photographs from My Pandemic 2020, they are on my website and I will link them right here. They're in full resolution so you can browse through them and enjoy them to your heart's content. Thank you to Harold Hooper for your donation. People like you keep this thing going. Thanks to all my Patreon supporters. I hate saying that at the end of the videos because, many of you will be asleep by then and might not hear my thanking you. The last thing I want to tell you is there is a small chance that you won't see me for a short while. That is because as soon as this video is uploaded, I'm going to try to fix my MacBook Pro. Yeah, I ordered a kit to fix it myself, and that's what I'm going to do. So there's a very good chance you won't see me till I get a new computer. But you never know. It might go well. Right. Okay, so let's get down to business. When Alison first asked me to do this, she asked me to do a video addressing the whole issue of halos, where they come from, why, what we can do about them, and so on. But in order to put the issue of halos in some kind of context, I thought I'd run through the other common artifacts that we see, give you a little bit of an idea about what causes them, and tell you how you can either reduce or remove them completely. It's important to remember that virtually all of the artifacts that we see are multifactorial. That there's usually not just one single cause. It's a combination of how the stacking program interprets the individual images, how it puts them together, but it can also be, artifacts can be caused by your camera, your technique, your lighting, the order in which you provide the photographs to the stacking program, and on and on and on. There are a lot of different things that can contribute, and it's usually not just one thing for a particular artifact. The first artifact we're going to talk about is the wiggly worm artifact that I'm sure everybody who has done any focus stacking at all has seen this. I call these the creeping snot balls because I want to, and I can, so that's what I named them. And they're relatively common, I hate to say. What they are photographs of debris on your sensor, usually dust, that appears as a soft, fuzzy artifact on the individual photographs. The reason that these things appear to be crawling towards the image, actually appear to be crawling away from the center of the image, is an artifact caused by the alignment program in your stacker. So when you instruct Zerine to run a PMax stack, say, on 100 photographs, the first thing that it's going to do is go to the last photograph in the stack and set that as the benchmark for the size. And then as each new photograph is examined by Zerine, it will correct the scale of that image so that it matches the scale set as the benchmark from the first image, all the way to the front. So it is incrementally reducing the size of the earlier images so that it will map perfectly onto the last image, which, by the way, is why problems with perspective are so difficult to manage, because Zerine isn't able to stack images that have different shapes. It causes all kinds of problems. But back to the slime balls. Once the image is downsized, your blob is going to move fractionally into its new position for the downscaled image. And if you have 100 of them, you're going to end up with 100 soft blobs that are moving in discrete increments. They appear to be spreading out from the center of the image, and that's all it is. It's a composite of 100 shots of a blob of detritus on your sensor. There are several ways that you can manage it. What I do is I frequently and carefully clean my sensor. And all I do, by the way, this is an aside, but all I do is take a charged sensor brush. I charge the sensor by forcing air through it from a clean lens cleaning blower, rocket blower. And that builds up a static charge. Then I just wipe it ever so gently right above the surface of the sensor, and it pulls most of the dust off. And I just routinely do that. If I've been out shooting outside and changing lenses outside, I'll do it more frequently. If the camera has never left the macro cage, I may do it, once every couple of weeks. You're going to hear me say this fairly frequently, but at the end of my list of recommendations to minimize or correct a lot of these artifacts, I'm going to add or get rid of it in Photoshop, because there are some of these artifacts you're not going to be able to remove, no matter how sophisticated you are with your settings and how careful you are with the photography. You're going to end up with artifacts that simply have to be cloned out in Photoshop. The next very common artifact, very frustrating, is to find banding on your background. So the cause is very simple. It's when the light changes between individual shots. So as you can imagine, there are so many ways that the light can change during your shot. This is one of the few benefits that I think continuous lighting has. If you can get past the problems that continuous lighting causes, long shutter speeds and what have you, motion blur. But continuous lighting, if it's good quality lighting and it's well controlled, can be pretty stable throughout your shot. This is a more commonly seen problem with flash, especially if you're mixing and mingling brands of flash or even models. Sometimes they don't play really well together and you can get variation in intensity. Another thing is that intensity can go wonky as the batteries run down. So if you're using a battery operated speed light, as most of them are, sometimes as the power starts to tail off, the lights get brighter for some reason, or mine do anyway. So be conscious of that. Now, in Zerine, there is a way for you to correct the lighting intensity. It doesn't do 100% of the job. If the fluctuations are really severe, it's not going to be able to correct that. So this is a matter of being really careful about how you set up your lighting. Use matched brand, matched model speed lights if you can, or studio lights if you're using them. Do all your settings manually. That's another way that this can happen, is if you're using TTL or something like that, and your camera is changing the intensity of the flash. As a last resort, if the banding is really bad, you can take the photograph into Photoshop, and sometimes what I'll do is I'll apply a heavy dose of blur to the background areas. I'll select my subject out and then I'll blur the whole background. And sometimes that'll get rid of it. Sometimes it doesn't. Number 3 is the problem of foreground transparency. We talked about that in a fairly recent video, and I'm going to show you an example. By the way, before I go any further, let me show you the test platform that we're using. The system is dead simple. I just have a crop frame Nikon DSLR on macro focusing rail. I'm using an 85 millimeter micro Nikkor lens. What else? A flash trigger, a couple of speed lights, one speed light for the background, which we may or may not use. And then the specimen consists of, it's 2 bendy arms basically, and I've made this collection of little items. They're all made out of string, but the idea was to be able to experiment with high and low contrast crossing. And string is really good. This kind of cord is really good because it has a very intricate weave pattern in it that you can see. And when you have blurring and softening, the pattern disappears. So I think this is a pretty useful tool. So you'll be seeing a bunch of the photographs that I took on this platform to try to recreate some of the issues that we're going to be talking about. So the way that transparency happens is it's because of the way your lens is made. As you're photographing the foreground elements, they're in nice sharp focus, and they're the pieces of the image that are going to be selected by the stacker. But as you move your plane of focus deeper into the subject, and now your background elements are in good focus, your foreground element is just a blurry mess. And you are photographing and recording elements looking straight through the foreground element because of the way the light converges. So when you stack those images, depending on how you have your stacking software set up, it is going to select parts of the image that are actually invisible. They're behind a foreground structure because they have higher contrast and they look more like detail. And when that happens, you end up with these fuzzy, indistinct, see-through foreground elements. And there are several ways you can address this. One, there is some very limited advantage to how you position your subject. If it is possible for you to position a subject so that the antennas are in fact against the distant background as opposed to traveling over the compound eye. And as I say, that's very limited because you may have much more pressing reasons why you want the animals, the insect's face in a particular direction, and the antenna is just getting in the way. The solution, if you cannot prevent it by the way you position the subject, is by doing what's called a selective stack. And I've got an example of what that looks like right here, where I simply selected about 3 images from this short stack where the red cord was in sharp focus, and I stacked those separately and then used that as an additional retouching source. So that when I was retouching the DMap image, I believe all I had to do was select my isolated red cord and retouch that in over that transparent mess. And the result is pretty good. It still leaves a little bit of haloing, and we're going to discuss how to deal with that in just a second. On rare occasions when I cannot get a good selective stack and I still have areas of transparency, I will fix it in Photoshop and I'll use whatever tools that I need to either clone or even sometimes paint in the bits that are transparent. It's better to try to get your final output image as good as possible before you take it to Photoshop. The more you have to do in Photoshop, the more obvious it looks. The next two artifacts are kind of the same thing, but I like to think of them as separate issues because the way I deal with them is different. And these two are ghosting and echoes. Sometimes you'll hear the words used interchangeably. I like to think of ghosting as problems with elements in the out of focus background. Most typically, you'll see this if you're doing a focus stacked landscape and the clouds are moving, as clouds will do from time to time. So that in each subsequent image, you've got your clouds scudding across the sky. And when you put them all together, you end up with this blurry cloud thing that doesn't look quite realistic. And it doesn't just happen with clouds in the sky, it happens with grass that's moving behind your subject or water that's rippling. And probably the best way to deal with ghosting is to prevent it from happening in the first place, which you can do oftentimes if you're outdoors by carrying some background cards with you and just making sure that your background stays constant in terms of color and luminosity, and you won't have any ghosting. Another option, of course, is to do your photography indoors where you have full control over the environment and you don't have anything moving in the background. Once the ghosting has appeared, then you're a little more limited in what you can do. But I'll tell you, there is a trick that I found extremely helpful for some kinds of background ghosting. And that is to run an extra pass of the DMap algorithm in Xerine, but with high settings for the estimation radius and the smoothing radius, the ER and SR. It's in the DMap preferences DMap settings, I think it is. Normally they're set, I think, at 10 for the estimation radius and 5 for the smoothing radius. I double that if I have ghosting in clouds, and then take that image, which is generally going to have a much softer, much more believable gradient in the out of focus areas, and I'll just paint those areas in when I'm retouching the final outputs that have the unpleasant ghosting. So that's one way you can do it. And of course, the other way, as I've already talked about, is take it into Photoshop and apply masks and blurring to make it less apparent that that cloud keeps showing up in different places. The other kind of ghosting is called echo, and I reserve that term for when I'm talking about foreground elements. It's when a foreground element moves in such a way that it can be photographed again in a different position. Now, if the limb moves in some ways, it may not leave an echo. Or the echo may not be very obvious. It may just be a loss of detail. It may be some motion blur, can manifest as a kind of halo. But it really takes a piece of well-coordinated bad luck to actually have your element move and then be photographed in great detail again. But it definitely happens. So count the legs on your insects. I'll put a reminder of how many legs insects have, but I won't do that. Just be careful. Be aware that that can happen. So how do you get rid of echoes? Well, it depends on where they are and how bad they are. Sometimes you can get rid of an echo by removing 1 or 2 or 3 frames from the stack. You have to be careful, though. When you remove frames, there may be other parts of the image that are in focus in those frames. And when you remove them, you can end up with an unsightly band of blurring. Because of the potential problems that are caused when you remove frames from a stack, I generally don't do that. Unless it's an incredibly isolated single frame issue where something went there and went back in one frame, that I might remove, especially if I got plenty of overlap in my stack. I would rather let the stacking program use the bad image and create that little bit of blur and then fix it in Photoshop. Of course, there is one other option, and that is to reshoot the stack. So while that's not a comprehensive list, it's certainly the things you're more commonly going to see. Now I want to talk about halos. Trying to put halos into a specific category is really difficult. Some halos you're going to see are very broad, very soft, quite subtle. Some halos are going to be very hard edge, very sharp, hugging very closely to the contours of a limb, say. And they're often associated with either tiny granules of what appears to be noise, all the way up to big splooge balls of ugliness, usually of a fairly uniform color, that are associated and hanging on to the edges of the halo. Some of the halos you'll see consist of an intermediate sized band around the structure, but a lot of color bleeding through that band. Again, it's not really a specific kind of halo, but it has a pretty characteristic appearance, and the way you would manage it would be a little different. And the last kind of halo that I would mention separately is kind of a psychedelic looking thing. It's a halo around a subject, but the halo disappears off into swirls and paisley patterns and other bizarre hallucinogenic shapes. Have you never seen those? I hope they're real. I hope that's not just me saying them. Anyway, that is a specific kind of halo that's caused from something different. So let's go through each of these in a little bit more detail, explain where they come from, and give you a couple of pointers on how you can avoid or fix them. So to make sense of halos, we really need to have an idea of what the depth map algorithm is doing when it processes your stack of photographs. There is a useful way to think about the depth map algorithm that's very similar to the way Mr. Littlefield, the inventor of the program, describes it on his website, on Zerine Stacker's website, where he describes it as a rubber sheet that is attached to certain places and not attached to others. And it's beautiful. It's a very elegant explanation. But I have a problem with rubber sheets. It was a childhood thing. So the way I visualize it is that when DMap interrogates a photograph in your stack, it looks at the image and it compares pixels to the pixels around it. Now, how many of the pixels it uses in that comparison is what you can set using the estimation radius slider, and I'll get more into that in just a second. But when the DMap engine finds a point that it believes to be in focus, it has a high level of confidence that that is in focus, it kind of puts a nail in it, and that becomes a pixel that will be included in the photograph. So as DMap goes through all of these images, it is selecting these high confidence of in focus points all the way down through the stack, and it is creating like a three-dimensional map of what's in focus and what's not. And for those areas that are not pinned, for those areas that DMap does not believe that they are in focus, what it does is try to create smooth gradations, smooth transitions between this in focus pixel and this in focus pixel, then a smooth transition between the two. That's how DMap works. And we have a great deal of control over how it makes those decisions using two primary controls: the estimation radius and the contrast threshold. So let me explain very briefly what those two things are. As I mentioned earlier, the estimation radius is telling the program how much of a pixel's surrounding area needs to be examined in order to determine whether or not something is in focus. So it applies to every pixel in the photograph. The same rule, the same level of estimation applies to every pixel. What is different about the contrast threshold? That's the slider that you move halfway through the DMap, where the further to the right you go, the more black comes in. That black is a mask. Think of it like a mask in Photoshop. And the places that are covered in black, you are telling Zerine, don't bother checking the pixels in this area. Just create a nice smooth transition. We don't care. There's no detail there, so don't go looking for it. Concentrate all of your efforts in the areas that are colored, that aren't masked out in black, and on those areas, use these estimation radius settings. I know that that's a lot and it sounds a bit complicated, but it is absolutely vital to understand that concept if you're going to understand how and why halos form and how you can manage them. So let's move on to the halos themselves. Let's talk first about the subtle, broad, very soft, slight loss of sharpness halos that are so commonly seen. They are going to be more obvious and they are going to be worse in areas of high contrast, especially when the foreground element is light colored and with a lot of detail, and the background is dark and blurry, like a black background. But let me explain what's going on with these soft halos. When DMap, instead of finding detail where detail exists, is trying to create a smooth transition to the background instead of showing the detail. And the reason for that is because the estimation radius is set too high. Basically, you're telling Zerine, okay, compare the pixels along this edge to everything else in the area. And when it does that, it doesn't return a point in focus. It returns an out of focus point, and therefore it creates a graded transition to the next in focus point. And there are a couple of different ways you can fix it. One is to rerun DMap with lower estimation radius. Another way around this is rerun DMap, and halfway through when it asks you to set the contrast threshold, set it way over to the right so that the black mask covers virtually everything except the edge of the area with the halo. It'll turn the inside of your subject black. You'll lose all kinds of detail on the inside, but you're not worried about it. You just want a sharp edge. So raise the threshold way high till you have a distinct line around the area that has the halo. Then finish the DMap and then use that as a retouching source. So when you start retouching the DMap stack that has the halo, you simply select on the second DMap stack as your source, and then use the retouching brush to just paint that sharp edge in, and it will not affect the inside, which presumably is sharp already, because you're only retouching along the edge. So it'll get rid of the halo without messing up the detailed areas in the image itself. Another way is, of course, to use the P-max as an input. If the P-max gives you the kind of sharp transition that you're looking for. I'm going to talk about this under a different kind of halo. Another thing to remember is big blurry halos can be a result of lighting. Like we talked about earlier, variations in lighting can cause these halos to form. And the way you would fix it would be the way I mentioned earlier, either to set the lighting correction in Zerine Stacker, or to use manual settings and a reliable set of lights so that you know that there aren't variations in intensity. Another fairly distinct kind of halo that you'll see is the halo that has all the psychedelic swirls around it. These are usually very disturbing. When you see them, you think something has gone badly wrong here. Usually what causes that is either having steps that were too long between images, or somehow getting your images in the wrong order, which is kind of hard to do if you're using Lightroom and Zerine hand in hand. The way you fix that is to either manually reorder the photographs into the order in which they were taken, front to back, or just shoot the whole thing again. And if it's as a result of lighting issues, then, because that will also cause these swirls, again, check your lights, make sure you're doing all the things we talked about to have reliable, consistent lighting from front to back. The next kind of halo is the tight, hard halo that sticks right onto the subject, and it almost always has chunks attached to it. So we'll call this tight, chunky halos. These things are an artifact caused in DMap, and the mechanism by which it happens is almost exactly the opposite of the way these large, broad, soft halos form. And it is because we're telling Zerine to find and preserve areas that are in sharp focus where there isn't anything in sharp focus. And what Zerine is doing is assuming we must mean that noise. When I have a DMap output image that is plagued by this kind of halo, I'll usually increase the estimation radius and run the thing again, sometimes more than once. In this case, it usually doesn't help to change the contrast threshold, and sometimes the only thing that I can think of to do is to reshoot the whole thing with a different set of settings and see what happens. This is a lot less likely to happen in areas that don't have quite so stark a contrast. Sometimes I end up just reshooting the stack, trying to find a way to reduce the contrast between the problem area and the background, maybe change the lighting. A lot of things can prove helpful, but it's a little hard to be able to predict exactly what's going to make the biggest difference. And of course, at the end of the day, there's always Photoshop. Though of the different kinds of halos, I think these are the hardest ones to fix in Photoshop. So for this last kind of halo, I'm going to riff fairly heavily on Mr. Littlefield's description in the information that you can find on the Xerion Stacker website, which I will link right here. I'm going to show you some example photographs of how these halos form and what they are, but I'm also going to kind of try to demonstrate it to you so you understand what's going on. When we have a white object and a black background, we can certainly see a halo around this. It's the first type of halo that we talked about, and the more contrast there is, the more likelihood that you're going to see a halo, and that's fairly simple to fix. But when we have one element that has a great deal of detail in it, like these chords actually do, and we want this to be in sharp focus, and we want this one to be in sharp focus too, and we have our background back here. Now what we're trying to do is, ideally, we're going to create a composite where the front element is in sharp focus and the back element is in sharp focus. That's why we're doing the focus stacking. And where the two abut, where they overlap, there is a sharp transition from the edge of the black detail to the white detail. But that doesn't happen. And that doesn't happen because nowhere in that stack is an image that has the front in focus and the back in focus at the same time. The front is no problem because we can get the front in focus almost regardless of what's behind it, though high contrast like this might be problematic. But when we move our focus plane forward and we start picking up the detail in the rear element of the subject, what's happened to the front element? Well, it has blurred out, meaning it's not a sharp outline, it's now a larger fuzzy outline. And we're taking photographs right through that fuzzy outline of the detail underneath. So what we end up with when we try to stitch all of those together into a composite is we end up with an area between the sharp focus black chord and the sharp focus white chord that's kind of gray. It's gray and it's indistinct and there's no detail in there. That's because we're shooting through the defocused front element to the back element. And if instead of using a black front element, we use a red one, the problem gets even more striking, because now as we're focusing on the rear element, we're shooting through a haze of red, which is the out of focus front element. So it creates this color bleed, a halo that has color bleeding out into the fuzzy loss of detail. That's why I'm comfortable calling these either color bleed halos or loss of detail halos, because they're really the same. And it is because there is nowhere in our stack that we have a photograph that we can use that shows the rear element in sharp focus by itself. Now, what can we do? Take up sports photography? Yes, you could if you wanted, but I would recommend just shoot the stack in PMax, which you should have done in the first place anyway, because PMax is fantastic at overcoming this problem. PMax, that is its strength, is to deal with crossing elements, because it can preserve the detail and to a large extent ignore that color bleed and the blurry loss of detail around it. So the way you fix this last kind of halo, the loss of detail color bleed halo, is simply to start out with your DMap image your final output from the DMap algorithm, and retouch it using the Pmax as an input, because the Pmax will have pretty close to a sharp edge between the foreground and the background. It'll show the detail on the close element as well as on the far element. It will still leave a small fuzzy area of haloing, but it's usually very small and very easy to fix in Photoshop. Remember that the strengths of the two algorithms in Xerine Stacker are, for Pmax, that it does this, that it can pick up the detail at contrasting depths and present it sharply and cleanly. The drawbacks of Pmax are that it tends to magnify or amplify noise, and it makes your images more contrasty. That's the drawback. In DMap, that doesn't happen. It doesn't add contrast, and it doesn't magnify or amplify the noise. So very often with the kind of photography that we have been doing with higher magnifications, the answer is to use both algorithms, to use Pmax where you want the sharp contrast, butting sharp contrast at different levels in the image, and for the rest of the image where you want to maintain those smooth gradients and nice colors and good textures, use the DMap. So you start with a DMap. Yeah, actually, I'm always asked this question: which image do I retouch from? I retouch from the image that is going to need the least amount of retouching to get it the way I want it. So sometimes it's the Pmax, sometimes it's the DMap, sometimes it's the flip of a coin. But usually the one that has the most nice stuff in it that I want to keep is the one I will retouch. And 9 times out of 10, when it's this issue, halos caused by two areas in focus that have an indistinct halo around the foreground element, I'll start with the DMap and retouch using the Pmax. That is a huge amount of information, but I hope it helps you understand what this whole issue of artifact is about. If you've been struggling with halos and you want some practical advice, set aside an afternoon to just work on understanding how the estimation radius and the contrast threshold play together. If you do that, you'll be a master focus stacking retoucher, because it's all right there. A huge thank you to Rick Littlefield for being so generous with the information he provides us and has done for years, both on his forum and on his Xerine Stacker website. It's so important for us as photographers to understand how these various tools work in order for us to overcome some of the really frustrating problems of focus stacking. So thank you, Rick. And thanks to all of you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned something new from it. And yeah, this is the kind of stuff I normally do on the program. So if this is useful to you and you want to hear more of it, I could certainly use your support. Please take a look at my Patreon page. If the mood hits you, I'll put the link in the show notes. Also, of course, you can make a contribution to the cause on my website. I will put the link to that page. Also, go over and look at the My Pandemic photographs. They will bring a tear to your eye, as they did to both of my eyes. I will either see you in a couple of days with something new, or I'll see you in a couple of months when I have a new computer. Wish me luck. Take care, everybody.